and welcome to The Everyday Therapist. This is my channel, and I am Dr. Deb. This is a place where we talk about all sorts of things psychological from both a research perspective and a clinical one, because I have background in both areas. So we have been talking about trauma, and today we're going to continue about focusing on trauma, specifically beginning to talk about trauma through the lifespan. Now, if you think about it, when a baby is born, just that act for that baby is traumatic. The baby is pushed out of a very narrow area, coming from a nice warm spot where it's been for the last 8.5 months or so, and goes down the vaginal canal and comes out to a totally new environment where temperature's a bit colder. And so baby comes out into the world in a level of distress. That's why, babies are born and they start crying. And at the hospital, they bundle the baby up and hand it to the mother. Usually, that's the usual steps that are taken. Now, infants, they cannot really explain when they are in distress other than by crying. Maybe they might squinch up their faces and things like that. But their ways of showing distress are not as well developed, obviously, as, say, an older child or an adult. So we know that infants do have distress, but the thing is, for a long time, humans, adults, really didn't understand about the sorts of things that cause trauma and stress in infants. For example, for a long time, there was this belief that infants did not experience pain at the same level as older children or adults. Now, it's recently come out, some recent research indicates that that conception is totally wrong. And the way the researchers figured it out was they took some newborn infants or yet very young infants, and during the course of, say, a physical exam, the infant would be hooked up to some various monitors, and the doctor would stick a pin in the heel of the baby, and information was recorded as to the baby's responses. Sometimes the baby would cry, sometimes the baby wouldn't cry. Sometimes the baby's heart rate would go up, but a lot of times heart rate is just interpreted as being the baby showing attention, is attending to something. One thing they did notice, though, was the brain waves that a baby who received a foot stick ended up being very similar to the brain waves of an adult who is going through pain. So even though the outward manifestation of the baby being in pain or traumatized was different than an adult, the brain functioned just like it would for an adult being through pain. Now, another aspect of stress for babies is there was this assumption that babies did not respond to certain stimuli in the same way that other animals do, or mammals. For example, there was a series of studies done back in the 1960s looking at how babies responded to what they could perceive as a ledge. Now, I'm going to share my screen and show you what that object looked like. Hopefully it will share. There we go. It's coming. Hopefully. Bear with me. It will come up. This is called a visual cliff. And this work was done primarily by a researcher by the name of Jacqueline Gibson. And what she found is that animals that are born with the ability to stand up immediately, such as horses and calves, when you put them on this kind of device, you put the animal over here on the glass over patterned surface, and that looks like a cliff. If you look down there, that looks really deep down there. Well, colts and other types of animals that are born with the ability to stand, they will not step over on this where it says glass only. They just sort of stay on the shallow side because the assumption is that they are afraid. Now, if you put a newborn baby on this device and you plop the baby on the glass side only, looking down to the floor, well, you get a little bit of a heart rate change. And as I said before, we assume that means that the baby is attending, that the baby is looking at it, but the baby is not really showing any distress. Now, if you wait until the baby is older, say 5 months, and you have the baby on the side where it says glass over patterned surface, the baby, and then have the mom be over on the edge where it says the deep side. If the mom tries to call the baby to come across over, sort of crawl over to the deep side, a baby won't. Babies will refuse to do that. And so the assumption that was made for many, many years is that newborns and very young babies do not fear this kind of ledge, whereas older babies do. Now, this may be the case, but there is also another consideration. Newborns are nearsighted. Their visual abilities are very, very poor. So yes, they are attending, but they may not really notice the fact that there is that much of a pattern difference. It just seems interesting to them. And it's just sort of fuzzy looking. So I am going to stop sharing. Okay, so I'm back here. So that's the visual cliff. And that was one of the early studies in looking at fear in infants. Now, if you think about it, babies end up being in somewhat traumatic situations just by being babies. They don't have words to explain things. They're left in frequently in cribs and places like that with a certain amount of stimulation, but they can become distressed, and they don't have a way of taking care of that distress. They have to communicate their needs to other people who may or may not come along and take care of the baby's distress. Now, what can happen is, say, a baby has to go back to the hospital for a long period of time, or a baby is in an orphanage. Things like that can result in long-term trauma for babies as they grow up. For example, there was some work done after World War II looking at the outcomes of children and infants who had been in orphanages and suffered a lot of neglect, and a lot of behaviors were observed that indicated that that kind of neglect really results in long-term negative outcomes. For example, in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which the DSM, and there's a new version that came out in, I think it was May, or an update, includes several different diagnoses that are the result of neglect, neglect of a very young child. For example, one is called reactive attachment disorder, and somebody who has reactive attachment disorder does not form bonds with other people very well. And if a child is suffering from RAD, reactive attachment disorder, the child will avoid being near people or try to get away. I've known of cases where, say, a child has been adopted out of the foster system in my area, and the child knows that he's being loved, but he doesn't trust it. So he runs away a lot. And it's very hard for the adoptive parent to actually reach that child, to get the child to understand that things are okay. Sometimes, though, a child who has been neglected from a very early age will show the exact opposite behavior. And I need to check my notes so I say things correctly. It's called disinhibited social engagement disorder. And what that means is the child, instead of avoiding getting close to people, the child will connect and hold on to somebody. It will go up to strangers and take the stranger's hand or anything to get attention from somebody else. And it's sort of the reverse of the reactive attachment disorder. Now, in addition to those kinds of disorders, young children can have post-traumatic stress disorder. They can have complex post-stress disorder. And some of the personality disorders that we see that usually get diagnosed with adults are really due to childhood traumas. Now, it all depends on when the traumas happened and how long they occurred, what kind of time frame we're talking about. So, well, let's go back and talk a little bit about how we code trauma and stressful situations, extreme stressful situations. If you remember, a lot of that information is coded in the mammalian part of the brain. There are just sort of like pictures of horrible situations that a person might hold on to. There might not even be any words to describe it, especially if it's something that happens to a young child. The child will not necessarily have vocabulary yet. But even for older people, older children and adults, very traumatic situations may not have any words associated with them. It's sort of like a picture of what's going on, or a series of pictures. And when I talk about how treatment can work, that will come back up, because a lot of treatment is connecting those pictures and getting a way to explain them to oneself without re-traumatizing oneself. So let's start with the personality disorder called borderline personality disorder. Now, one thing we need to keep in mind is that every person is born with his or her own nervous system and stage of development of that nervous system at birth. Some babies are born with a very sensitive nervous system. For example, when I work with a client, one of the things I'd ask is, were you a colicky baby? Because if a person says, yes, my mom said I was colicky, or my grandma or whomever said, I always seem to have an upset stomach from birth for about the first 4 or 5 weeks. Well, that is an indicator to me that the person may have been born with a highly sensitive nervous system from the very beginning. And people who have a highly sensitive nervous system tend to be affected by stress and trauma more severely than people who have less or have more well-developed systems when they are born. In fact, if you want more information about this sort of thing, there's a website, which I'll link in the description, about the highly sensitive person. And there's some online quizzes to see if you're a highly sensitive person or if your child is a highly sensitive person. And some of the things that will help with those kinds of problems that somebody who is like that will potentially experience. So say you have somebody who's a child who's born, who's very sensitive to being talked to in different ways. And there's another thing to remember about babies is they don't understand language at all, especially in the first 6 months or so. They respond to tone of voice. So you can say, you're a wonderful baby. And baby won't know that you're saying nice things. They'll only pick the tone. Or you can say, I really hate you, my little pin, or whatever. That's all the baby will. That is all the baby will respond to is the tone. So if you think of a young baby, the baby has his or her needs: food, stay warm, have diaper changed. The baby will be responding to the caregiver and will be responding to the caregiver's tone. Now, as the child begins to develop language, the child will pick up on the good words and the bad words, and along with the tone. So if you take a child who is anywhere from, say, a year to about 5, and the child starts experiencing or continues to experience various kinds of trauma, whether it's abuse or neglect, along with things such as reactive attachment disorder, the child might begin to experience certain ways of adapting to the situation. And they may be fine at that age for the child, but they become not so good ways to adapt as an adult. So let's take a child who has had a lot of trauma up through like a 3-year-old. What will happen is, if you think about what a 3-year-old is like, a 3-year-old tends to think the world revolves around him or her. That's called being egocentric. And a 3-year-old also is very concerned about holding on to the caregiver. A 3-year-old fears loss. 3-year-old thinks everything that is happening in the environment is because of whatever he or she's doing. And that little child will begin to see the people in his or her environment as either protectors or evil people. It's like one or the other. And that child will try to do everything possible to keep the protector around, but sometimes the protector will do things that cause the child to devalue that protector. And then the protector becomes the evil person. But it's always the child is thinking, it's my fault. Whatever I did is causing the good person to not be good anymore. I need to change. I need to be how that person wants me to be. And the thing is, the child can only handle that for so long before having a meltdown or just going into depression. And child who has that kind of trauma and way of being will kind of get frozen like that as he or she moves through the life cycle. And that is the sort of the stereotype of somebody who's we call a borderline personality disorder person. So that's what happens when there's trauma, a certain amount of trauma between before the age of like 5 or 6. Now, I'm going to stop at this point, and next time we'll talk about narcissistic personality disorder and dissociative disorders, because those are all trauma related too. But before I go, I want to give you a little hint about another way to reduce your anxiety. Now, many people like to use aromatherapy to help them in their environment. Well, it turns out there are only a few aromas that actually are beneficial. Now, you may have identified aromas throughout your life that will bring back pleasant memories, such as, say, the smell of cinnamon might remind you of apple pie baking, and you always liked apple pie. Well, those are your personal sense aromas that are good for you. But the thing is, there are certain aromas that seem to be good for everybody, help reduce anxiety for everybody. And the way we know this is that there have been several research studies looking at the effect of different aromas on the behavior of mice. Now, the thing is with mice or lab rats, they cannot be affected by the placebo effect. You can't say to a mouse, oh, I'm going to give you this wonderful aroma to smell, and it's going to make you feel calm. The mouse doesn't care because mice don't speak. So what researchers do is they put some mice in a box, a plexiglass box, and introduce some aromas, various ones. And one that they have found through many studies that is consistent in calming the mice or lab rats down is jasmine. Sandalwood is a good second, and lavender is known to do it too. But jasmine, the aroma of jasmine is very conducive to calm. So that's something to keep in mind if you're going out looking for something nice to have in your environment, is to think of jasmine. So that's all for today. I'll be back again, hopefully in the near future. It took me a while because I had a really bad throat head thingy going on. But if you found this to be useful information, please think of subscribing and turning on the notifications bell. And if you think this is useful information for any of your friends, please let them know so they can find out about this sort of thing too. So until the next time, see ya. Bye.